Hello everybody, this is Dr. Gary Mrozinski from Luzerne County Community College, and this is Principles of Economics 2, Microeconomics. This is Chapter 10, Part B. The content from this presentation comes mostly from The Microeconomy Today by Schiller and Gebhardt, published by McGraw-Hill. So this is Part B. You've just looked at Part A, I'm assuming. And what we're going to do to start Part B is return to the example that we developed with the purely competitive market in the last chapter. And that was the PC market. And what we're going to do here is imagine that there are all of these individual PC manufacturing plants that previously were individual sellers. Well, imagine that they're under the control of one company, and we'll call that Universal Electronics. So Universal Electronics owns all of these manufacturing plants, and there's lots of them. And in order for this to be a monopoly and for there to be just one seller in this market, there has to be some sort of barrier to entry, some sort of total barrier to entry. Let's say that is a patent on the microprocessor that is needed to produce these computers. All right, and there's no other microprocessor available. And so this is a monopoly, and there are lots of smaller manufacturing plants, but under the control of one company. This is unlikely because if you were a monopoly, you would not be producing out of lots of small manufacturing plants, for the same reason that when the Industrial Revolution began, there was a transition from the cottage system of producing goods and services, lots of small producers, to the factory system of producing products. The advantages are economies of scale advantages. So you wouldn't really ever see this, but we're going to put that to the side for the moment and assume that there are lots of smaller manufacturing plants, but again, they're all under the ownership of Universal Electronics. This allows us to compare the behavior of the market as pure competition, which we've already looked at, to the behavior of the market under the control of monopolists, because each of the marginal cost curves and average total cost curves would be the same as pure competition. What's different, however, is that now the individual firms don't have a horizontal demand curve anymore. They have a downward sloping demand curve, because if the monopolist instructs all of the plants to produce more, the monopolist has to lower the market price. And if the monopolist wants to increase the market price, it has to instruct all of these plants to produce a smaller amount, smaller quantity. That's the downward sloping demand curve. And because there's a downward sloping demand curve, there's also going to be a downward sloping marginal revenue curve, which is different from the demand curve. Marginal revenue will be less than price. We've already looked at that. That will apply to the individual sellers as well as to the market. The graph on the left is the individual manufacturing plants' revenue and cost situation. There's a downward sloping demand curve. I've just explained why that's the case, different from when it was a purely competitive market, and a separate downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Now previously we saw that be dashed. It's not dashed here, but it's a lighter color blue curve. You can see that. That's marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is less than price at every Q, except Q equal to 1. All right? You've got an average total cost curve, that U-shaped curve. We understand the significance of that. There's a marginal cost curve, and then to the right you can see that is the market supply and demand curve. It's only a supply curve if it's pure competition, however. Now it's only on this graph so that we can compare it to the monopoly situation. Remember, the monopolist has no supply curve, but with pure competition it's the marginal cost curve. the market marginal cost curve, which comes from the marginal cost curves of all the individual sellers, right? All right, so we're going to try to compare and contrast pure competition to monopoly. So, on the left, that's the individual firm. If you remember, when this was pure competition, the individual seller would choose to produce where price, which is marginal revenue for them, was equal to marginal cost. That would be point C. So if this were pure competition, then each individual seller, and imagine that they're all the same size, would be producing $600 per month. And the price would be $1,000. Slide over to the right. You can see that corresponds with market equilibrium if it's pure competition, where the demand curve and the supply curve, marginal cost, are intersecting. And there's many of these sellers, and you can see there's 24,000 collectively that they're producing. Okay, back to the left. This is the individual firm. This is not pure competition. This is a monopoly instead. So the monopolist will look at where marginal cost and marginal revenue are intersecting. All right, so pick those two graphs out visually. Find the intersection. You see it? Point M. Drop down to the x-axis. That corresponds with a Q max, profit maximizing level of output, of 475 computers per month. Each seller will produce that much, and the corresponding price then will be, follow the dashed line vertically up to the demand curve, $1,100. So point W is the monopoly outcome. That is the monopoly price. The monopolist will choose to produce that at that price by telling its manufacturing plants to each produce 475 computers per month instead of 600. One thing that you're going to see is that if it's a purely competitive market, the market output will be greater than if it's a monopoly. The monopolist will produce less than society wants it to produce in order to raise the market price to the point that they're maximizing market profits. That's the goal of the monopolist. I think most of this I've probably already covered. If the demand curve is downward sloping, which is the case here, then marginal revenue curve is a separate curve, also downsloping. They actually meet where Q is equal to 1. Sometimes that's not even shown on the graph if it's like the graphs you've just seen are much larger. I mean, hundreds. Q are in the hundreds, so it's not even clearly shown on the graph. But they do meet at Q equal to 1. Just mathematically, that's going to be a certainty. And the market demand is the same as in purely competitive market. The demand curve comes from the consumer. It has nothing to do with the seller. The sellers don't determine the market demand curve. That has to do with market conditions that the consumer is experiencing. And again, this is talking you through what I've already shown you on the graph. In the early stages of the computer boom, this is when it was pure competition. The equilibrium price was 1,000. So if you, again, a couple slides ago, you saw that the market supply and demand curve, the intersection equilibrium happened at 1,000, and that corresponded with an equilibrium output of 600. Something I didn't mention on the previous graph, but I'm going to mention a few more times as we go forward in this course, is that with pure competition, when you're producing at the intersection of supply and demand, which is the demand curve and the marginal cost curve, the market marginal cost curve, P is equal to marginal cost, right? That is actually what's called allocative efficiency. The best you can do in terms of allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency has to do with whether the productive resources in a product market are being deployed in accordance with what society wants. Society wants for that market to be producing a quantity where the price is equal to the marginal cost, and that corresponds with Q equal to 600. So what does that mean? Well, think of it this way. Price represents the value of the product per unit to the consumer. Marginal cost to the seller represents the value of the resources used to produce the product. When they're equal, then that is the maximum allocative efficiency you can achieve. And that happens with pure competition. With monopoly, we're not producing at a level of output where price is equal to marginal cost. Price will always be greater than marginal cost, and that makes the quantity be a smaller amount. The market output, if it's a monopoly, will be 475 computers per month. That's less than society wants. Society wants for there to be 600. The monopolists will withhold and intentionally produce less than that in order to drive the price up so that they're experiencing maximum profits. We can mathematically figure out how much total profit per month the individual producers, the individual sellers, are contributing to the monopoly. Think of the graph. It'll appear on the next slide, but you remember it, right? There was a shaded area that represented profit, so that was a rectangle. On the y-axis, we had the upper edge of the rectangle was price. That comes from the demand curve, and that was $1,100. The lower edge of the rectangle comes from the U-shaped average total cost curve, and that was $630. And this again is at Q equal to 475. So then profit is equal to price minus average total cost, that's the vertical dimension of the rectangle, times Q, that's the horizontal dimension of the rectangle. So then $1,100 minus $630 is $470. That's the profit per unit times 475 units, and so your monthly profit per individual plant is $223,250. So that will be more than we previously saw when it was pure competition, because each plant is producing a smaller quantity, because that's what the monopolist has instructed them to do in order to drive the price up and earn more profits. There again is the graph, and you can see these points on the graph. Looking at the profit shaded area, the rectangle on the top edge of, you can see that's defined by a price of $1,100. The bottom edge, that's defined by an average total cost of $630. And then the horizontal dimension is Q, 475. So 475 times the quantity, 1,100 minus 630. And that's where our profit comes from. So why is it that the monopolist will produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost? We've already been through this, and this applies to the monopolist. It applies to all of the other market structures. If the marginal revenue of the Q that you're producing per month is greater than the marginal cost, then you would earn more profit by increasing Q. If the marginal revenue of the Q that you're producing is less than the marginal cost of the Q that you're producing, then you should decrease output to make profits go up. The best you can do is where marginal revenue and marginal cost are the same. That is the profit maximizing rule. Just memorize that and know it. And if you're looking at a table of data and you have a column for marginal revenue and a column for marginal cost, just go down those two columns and find the point where they're the same, or the point at which the largest Q for which marginal revenue is still greater than marginal cost, and then look at the corresponding Q. That's the profit maximizing level of output. If you're looking at a graph, you simply look for the intersection of those two curves, marginal revenue and marginal cost. That's the way we're always going to do it. So let's do this again. If you're looking at these graphs, You're going to first look for the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. Marginal cost is the upward sloping blue curve. Marginal revenue is the downward sloping, now in this case it's dashed again, which I like, makes it stand out a little bit. Look for their intersection. Okay, that's a point. Now, drop down to the x-axis. Q sub m. That is the quantity that will maximize profit. Now, follow that dashed vertical line up to the demand curve. Point A. That will be the profit maximizing price. That's what the monopolist will do. It will choose to produce Q sub m units per month and charge $1,100. What if this were pure competition? And this is the market supply and demand curve. Well, now the marginal cost curve is the supply curve. So you're going to produce at the point where price is equal to marginal cost. The demand curve and the supply curve are intersecting. The demand curve and the marginal cost curve are intersecting. That's point X. That will be the purely competitive outcome. And that corresponds with an output of Q sub C. Whatever that number is, that's how many computers per month this market will produce if it's pure competition. Oh, and for the consumer, even better, the price will be lower. The price will be $1,000. Why is this a monopoly to begin with? There must be some sort of barrier to entry. So we're going to talk about various barriers to entry, and this will come up again in the next chapter. There must be something that's keeping the other sellers out. And there also can be no close substitutes for the product, because that's part of there being a barrier to entry. This is bad because there's no competitive pressure. The monopolist will just choose a higher price. That's bad for the consumer. But then, as I mentioned previously, the monopolist will also have no competitive pressure to innovate and to come up with better designed products, better designed production processes, which could lower the production cost per unit to produce the product, which could potentially, in a normal market where there's competition, could lower the market price. There's no pressure for any of that to happen, and that's bad for the consumer as well. Monopolies are illegal in the United States. We actually have antitrust laws. The Clayton Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act are very old laws, which have been updated along the way, but they're both of them 100 years old. There are a few cases where we do have monopolies or near monopolies. Public utility companies are monopolies. These are monopolies that our government allows to happen because it just makes sense for there to be just one provider of domestic water to a neighborhood. Think about what it takes to have that underground network of piping going to the houses in a neighborhood. It would be duplication of infrastructure for there to be two providers of residential water service, domestic water, to a neighborhood. It would make everybody's costs go up. And so it makes sense for there to be just one network of underground pipes. And so the government allows it to happen. And the water company is not a government entity. They are a private company that earns profits, but they have to be then regulated by a government agency, the Public Utility Commission. And what the PUC wants to ensure is that the company is earning a profit, a fair return on their investment of capital, but they're not charging a monopoly price. So they regulate the price. Every time your electric company wants to raise the price per kilowatt hour, they have to petition the PUC, Public Utility Commission, and demonstrate that their costs have gone up and that they're losing money at the current rate. And so the Public Utility Commission will review that and allow them to increase to a certain new price level, right? But those are the exception. There are some other markets that are near monopolies. Intel has 80% of the PC microprocessor market. It's not a monopoly, but that gives them lots of market power. Did you know that Whammo has 90% market share in the market for throwing discs. And you're probably saying to yourself, throwing discs? Why isn't he just saying frisbees? Well, frisbee is the Whammo product, and we think of the product as a frisbee, but there are competitors to the frisbee, but collectively they only make up 10% of the market share. And so that is pretty close to being a monopoly. Professional sports teams geographically are monopolies. Here's just a summary of differences between a competitive market and a monopoly market. In a competitive market, if the business firms are experiencing a profit, that's going to attract other sellers, and if there are not significant barriers to entry into the market, they'll come in. That shifts the market supply curve to the right, makes the market price come down because now the new equilibrium, the new intersection point, is at a lower price, and that then forces the individual firms to lower their price. That shrinks their profit. Ultimately, in the market output happens where price is equal to marginal cost. So again, the value of the product per unit to the consumer, P, is equal to the value of the resources, the productive resources that are used to produce the product to the seller, marginal cost, and that is the ultimate in allocative efficiency. With a monopoly, high profits but barrier to entry excludes new suppliers, so you're never going to see competitive pressure shifting, or the profit that the monopolist is experiencing attracting sellers, which would shift the supply curve to the right, which would drive down the price. This is not happening in a monopoly because of that barrier to entry. And so economic profits don't change, they don't reduce. Price is greater than marginal cost, so there's that imbalance, and that's where the profit comes from. And so that ultimately is the difference between monopoly and pure competition. The monopolist chooses the price it wants to charge based on maximizing profit. It does not respond to changes in the market price and then respond by changing its quantity supply. That's what a supply curve would be telling you. Well, they don't have a supply curve for that reason. They don't respond to market prices. They set the market price. They set the market price where industry profits, their profits, are maximized. Here are some of the entry barriers. Patents. One feature of our economy is that if a business develops a new product or even a production process and then is awarded a patent, so there's an application process that's involved, then they are awarded a monopoly market for a period usually of 20 years. They can produce it with no competition, ideally, and so they can charge a monopoly price. The reason that we think this is a good idea because they can then recoup their research and development dollars they spent to develop the product. So the pharmaceutical industry, for example, typically spends $1 billion developing a new drug, and it takes like 10 years in their labs to be going through all of the clinical trials so that they can understand the potential impact on the patient and the probability that these impacts will happen, and they fully understand that. And data is submitted to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and then finally when the FDA is satisfied that the product is ready for market, then they'll be able to then sell it, and they'll be awarded a patent, and then they can sell it at monopoly prices for a period of 20 years. Then when the 20 years when that clock runs out, the market can shift overnight from a monopoly to pure competition, because now everybody can produce. And that information, public information, the design of that drug is understood, and others can copy it. And so that's why you then see competition emerge once that 20-year clock runs out. Monopoly franchises are another example of this. Professional sports teams, they are given a monopoly, awarded a monopoly, and so do they really have any competition? I'm actually going to a Philadelphia Phillies game tomorrow night with my son and my wife, and we are Phillies fans, and they're charging monopoly prices. But if the price got too high, I guess I could go to a Mets game. That's not too far away. It's probably the same distance from my house as Philadelphia is. But we're kind of trained to consider the Mets as being our competition, being our enemy, in other words. And so are they really competing with the Mets for fans? Not really. So that really makes them closer to a monopoly than any other kind of market structure. Sometimes it's control of key inputs. If a commercial airline wants to sell their product in northeastern Pennsylvania, then they have to go through the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton International Airport and pay the fees to that airport. That airport has control of key inputs because they control landing rights. And you can see some other examples in the software industry. If a software developer wants to develop an app that's going to run on an Apple device, they need access to the proprietary source code for the Apple operating system, iOS. They have to pay for that. They pay Apple for that in order to be able to develop their apps. So that is Apple controlling a key input, and that is an entry barrier. Sometimes a larger firm will sue a smaller competitor out of existence because the smaller competitor will not be able to afford the exorbitant legal costs to defend themselves against a larger near monopolist, let's say. And here's one example in 2019. MyPillow, a larger company, sued upstart I Love My Pillow, which had 9 employees, for trademark infringement for using the My and Pillow in Google search ads, and this drove them out of business. Sometimes the larger firm, MyPillow, could have chosen to purchase I Love My Pillow. Now they would only do that if I Love My Pillow had a different and maybe more innovative product that they wanted to acquire and then be able to sell. That's usually the cases where you see a larger firm acquiring a smaller firm when they're viewed as a potential threat if they were to grow larger. Live Nation acquired Ticketmaster in 2010, and that is pretty close to being a monopoly. If you are going to a sporting event, let's just limit this to concerts, music concerts. What they do is they sign the touring musical artist to an exclusive contract and say, Ticketmaster, we will sell your tickets, but you cannot you cannot distribute your tickets any other way. It's an exclusive contract with us. So who are their potential competitors? Really, today it's the venue. Sometimes the venue will sell their own tickets. They'll have their own box office. But many venues don't even bother to do that anymore. They just use Ticketmaster. So this is pretty close to being a complete monopoly. Economies of scale are a significant barrier to entry. You cannot start producing automobiles. And I usually, in the classroom, I almost jokingly present an example of an automobile manufacturing plant that's going to start in downtown Nanticoke, and we're going to start by producing a couple cars per year. Well, you could never do that because you could never afford, it would never be economically feasible for you to purchase the very expensive and sophisticated automation, production automation, that would allow you to lower your per unit cost and make you competitive on price with other larger auto manufacturers like Ford and Daimler Chrysler and General Motors. So you have an economies of scale disadvantage. And so that is a barrier to entry. You have to start large, in other words. You have to have the resources to start large in order to enter the automobile manufacturing market. The monopolist does not have absolute power because, remember, the demand curve is something that consumers collectively control. The monopolist has no control over the demand curve. They could pick the point on the demand curve that they want to operate, but the demand curve is beyond their control. So it could be that there's a decrease in overall demand for the product. Consumers' tastes could change. Then that's going to affect the monopolist. The monopolist would have to respond to that. There could be a substitute developing in the economy for the monopolist's product. That would affect them. In any event, the monopolist will not gouge the customer if you define gouging as being charging the maximum or the highest price possible. And I've already explained this, but the monopolist will choose the price at which profit is maximized, and that's not the highest price. It's something less than the highest price, but still, it depends on how you define the term gouge, I guess. It's still the worst case for the consumer. What we're going to do in Part C of Chapter 10 is return to a discussion of price discrimination, if you recall from Chapter 5. That's when different groups of customers are charged different prices and the effect that that can have on profit. So I'll see you in Part C.